Today, it's finally time to turn this empty glass enclosure into an epic slice of jungle for some poison dart frogs. Everything you have seen on this channel for the past few weeks has been leading up to this moment. This is episode 4 of my series Vivarium Rebirth, where I'm dismantling and rebuilding my biggest vivarium to take it to the next level. All the previous episodes of the series can be seen in order in the playlist linked in the description, but you can also enjoy this video on its own or go back and watch the others later. This enclosure is an Exoterra measuring 90 by 45 by 90 centimeters or 36 by 18 by 36 inches. To cover the back and sides of this vivarium, I decided to use a material called hypertufa in this build. It's a synthetic mesh designed for growing epiphytes. It can lift and hold a bit of water, but it always remains at a proper moisture level without becoming soaking wet. After cutting up pieces of hypertufa with a pair of scissors, I attached it to the glass using aquarium silicone. I really like using hypertufa when it's flat against the glass like this, since it feels more like a black, neutral background rather than a part of the scape itself, even though plants can still grow well on it. I always let the hypertufa go all the way to the bottom of the enclosure, since it will be able to suck up water from the drainage layer. Keep the orientation of the hypertufa in mind. From my experience, it seems like it can lift more water if the oval holes in it are vertical rather than horizontal. Now it's almost time to put the bigger elements in place, but before that I put down a sheet of styrofoam in the back half to elevate them a bit. For this build, I made an artificial buttress root tree out of blankets dipped in cement and a fake rock wall out of hypertufa. I have shown in detail how I made these in the previous episodes of the series. Before attaching the rock walls, I scratched up the foam on the back of them. I'm not sure how much of a difference this made, but the idea is that the uneven surface will be easier for the silicone to adhere to. Then I applied a bunch of silicone to them before putting them in place. I made sure to put plenty of silicone around the edges to stop any animals from getting behind them. Now it was time to put the tree in place. It will actually stand completely on its own, and in theory it's removable. Here I had a big decision to make. Given that it was constructed with blankets, there is a massive void behind it. This left me with two options. Either I would have to seal all the edges and make it absolutely impossible for any frogs to get behind it, or I would have to make it so easy to get behind it and also get out of there that there wouldn't be any risk of frogs getting stuck there. I would have preferred the first option, but I wasn't confident that I would be able to seal it off completely, given that there are some parts of it that are very hard to reach, so I decided on the other option. There is now a large gap at the top and a hole on one of the sides that they can easily get through. I think the space behind the tree will be very uninteresting for the frogs, because there's nothing there, and once they realize that, I'm hoping they will simply stay out of there for the most part. Now it's time for the substrate, or rather the lack thereof. In this vivarium, I decided to use a sponge filter mat, which serves as both the substrate and the drainage layer at the same time. It weighs almost nothing, it doesn't get affected by standing in water, and plants actually grow really well straight in it. But more on that later. The filter foam is very easy to cut using scissors, knives and razor blades. I cut out the larger main pieces and eventually used some spare pieces to fill in some small gaps that remained around the base of the tree. I also made it a bit higher in the back than in the front to make it look a bit less flat. The sponge filter mat I'm using is 30 ppi, which stands for pores per inch. The higher the ppi, the denser the foam will be. Somewhere around 20 to 35 ppi is good, and if that number is any higher, water will flow through it very slowly, which is very annoying for numerous reasons. I also decided to do a small water feature in this vivarium, so I guess this technically makes this my first paludarium. I simply carved out a nice pond in one of the filter foam pieces. I have to mention that water features are usually not recommended for dart frog vivariums for two main reasons. I'm not going to bore you out with that for half the video, but if you're seriously considering a water feature in your vivarium, I highly recommend you to pause and read this disclaimer. I wanted a fairly open layout without too many branches, with the exception of these two driftwood pieces in the corner. This is because I couldn't find any that would look good in there, I didn't want to obstruct the view of the background too much, and I have many plants that will eventually get massive leaves, which I really wanted to leave room for. Normally, I would definitely recommend having more branches, but in this case, living plants will fill out the tank eventually. Now it was time to modify the top of the enclosure to decrease the amount of ventilation and thereby retain the humidity better, since it's difficult to maintain a proper humidity for dart frogs with a full screen mesh top. Converting the top is actually very easy. All you need is 2 pieces of glass, a stainless steel mesh and some silicone. First, I put down a bead of silicone on this small plastic edge and lay the glass on top of it, with a gap for the mesh between the pieces. Before adding the mesh, I made 2 holes in it. This will be for the misting system and for the pump in the water feature. To add the mesh, just put down some more silicone on top of the glass and put down the mesh. Use some extra silicone on the short sides to avoid making a gap between the mesh and the plastic. The mesh wouldn't stay flat on its own at first, since I had kept it rolled up, but if you put some small rocks on top of it for the first few minutes while the silicone gets to work, it'll fix itself. Once I had the silicone tube right there, I tried making some small planters out of hygrolon that I could use for bromeliads and other epiphytes. As you can see, I just cut out some hygrolon, folded it, applied silicone and pressed it into the background. These weren't that stable though, so I removed some of them and I don't think I'll do this again, but it was worth a try. Installing the misting system was really easy, since I just reused the line of nozzles that I previously had in this Vivarium and simply plugged them back into the misting pump. I used the magnetic nozzles, so you can connect multiple ones on the inside of the Vivarium, only needing 1 hole for a single bulkhead through the top instead of 3. The misting system I use is from Dusk Tropics, but I believe it's very similar to Mist King, which is more common internationally. I did get a small pump just to circulate the water a bit, since I didn't want all of it to be completely stagnant. To make room for it, I cut out a hole for it in the filter foam using a razor blade. I then ran a hose between the filter foam pieces from the pump all the way to the other side of the enclosure to get some circulation, but I didn't make a waterfall or anything like that. To hide the cable, I simply made a slit in the filter foam and pressed it into it. Then I ran it behind the tree all the way up to the top. To run it through the hole I had prepared for it in the mesh top, I had to cut the wire and reconnect it with a new plug outside of the enclosure. I wrapped the pump in some hygrolon so it wouldn't vibrate straight against the glass, and then I covered it with a nice piece of filter foam. It's very important that the pump is accessible for maintenance in case it gets clogged or stops working, so I wouldn't recommend foaming it into your background or covering it in a deep substrate layer. Now it was finally time to fill it up with water and give it a test run. I have to mention that I bought the weakest pump I could find and set it to its minimum effect, which is 170 liters or 44 gallons per hour. My hope is that the tadpoles will be able to grow up in the water feature, and they don't really want a strong stream of water. While we were talking about all the technical stuff, I should mention that I decided to get a small fan that I put above the ventilation, blowing into the Vivarium. This is because it stayed a little too humid on the inside due to the large amount of water at the bottom and mainly the hygrolon lifting that water up and increasing the humidity. I currently have the fan on for 30 minutes 4 times per day, but it's also a very weak one. Next up, I added a bit of loose substrate to a few places. Mainly these flat grounds at the base of the tree that I wasn't able to remove. Since there will be a little bit of water collecting here, I decided to go with a layer of pumice, which you could say acts as a mini drainage layer. It's a somewhat light material, but not as porous and dusty as perlite, which I would avoid in cases like this due to the risk of it causing skin irritations to amphibians. The pumice is a bit dusty at the start too, but much less so than perlite, and once you have sprayed it down a few times, it's totally fine. I then topped off the pumice with a tiny layer of reptile bark. Now it's finally time to plant the Vivarium. For this I used various cuttings, mostly from other plants I already had in my collection. I reused a lot of plants that used to be in this Vivarium before I tore it down and rebuilt it. If you're wondering how I stored those plants for the past 2 weeks, I simply took cuttings and placed them in plastic bags, which I kept a bit humid on the inside. This works really well, and some species even started growing roots in these bags. To plant cuttings in the filter foam, you can simply make a cut with a razor blade and squeeze the plant into it. Sometimes you can also make a small package out of sphagnum moss immediately around the base of the cutting, but in this case I have so much water in the bottom of this vivarium that the sphagnum would just get completely soaked and start rotting if I did this. At first, you might think that the plants can't get enough nutrients in this filter foam, but this is simply incorrect. You could compare it to when you are rooting a cutting in water, except you let it stay in the water forever and add slightly more nutrients over time in the form of frog poop and decomposing leaf litter. In filter foam, I've only tried planting cuttings with or without small aerial roots. If you were to instead take a large plant with roots grown in soil, I have my reasons to believe it wouldn't appreciate the transition and that those roots would rot. I attached bromeliads and other epiphytes to the hygrolon using toothpicks. I also planted some orchids and ferns by putting their roots in a small package of living moss and situating it on top of the hypertufa background. I placed a lot of cuttings of climbing plants around the base of the tree and the rock wall, so they will slowly but surely climb up against it, just like they would in nature. I say this in almost all of my build videos, but I really like planting my vivariums very sparsely in the beginning. This is because I think it looks much better in the long run if you start with tiny cuttings and let them grow and shape themselves after the vivarium, rather than squeezing in large plants that don't always fit in very well. When you start with large plants, they often look out of place and you can sometimes tell that they didn't grow in that environment. Sure, the vivarium doesn't look super lush and green yet, but in a few years from now, I will be very happy that I took this approach. However, this is only about my personal preference, and the frogs definitely won't mind if you want to start with larger plants, so your vivarium will fill in a bit faster. With a few plants, including some larger species, I intentionally used multiple cuttings of the same species throughout the vivarium. For instance, I have 3 Anthurium radicans ex luxurians that I distributed across the bottom, and I have 2 Philodendron atabapoense ex bilietiae on different walls. I think it makes sense to have it this way, since it feels more like a natural place where certain plants are naturally occurring and abundant, rather than each plant being a one-off thing. When I was picking the background covering plants in this vivarium, I stayed away from anything too fast growing, such as Ficus pumila quercifolia, and Ficus sagittata. I also avoided large begonias that you have to trim often. Instead, I mostly chose Markgravias for this purpose. This means that it will take an extra year or two before the walls are covered in greenery, but it will not have to be trimmed down as often in the long run, and these Markgravias won't start choking all the other plants as easily as some ficus species would. The majority of the plants I used in this vivarium are aroids, which is a family of plants consisting of Philodendron, Monstera, Anthurium, Rhaphidophora, and some other plants. During the pandemic, the market for these plants exploded and many of them went for ridiculously high prices. However, since then, many species that used to be extremely rare have become much more widely available, and the prices they sell for are dirt cheap compared to what they went for when I got into the aroid hobby in 2020. For instance, Philodendron UPI could easily sell for over $2,000 a few years ago, but now I was able to get this one for the equivalent of $24. This entire shipment of 3 species that I got for this tank, all of which used to be very rare, cost me only about $80 now, so with a time machine you could make a large profit. I used a bit of moss in this tank, mainly around the water feature. I mostly used aquarium mosses like Java moss, Christmas moss, and weeping moss. The key to successfully growing moss is to keep it really moist and not let it dry out at all for the first month or so. After that it will be somewhat established and less sensitive. I also used a moss mix from Dusk Tropics. This contains a bunch of spores from mosses and ferns. I just mix it up with water, let it sit for 10 minutes, and started painting it across the hygrolon and on the hypertufa rock wall. I have honestly gotten more ferns than mosses from this mix over the years, but the moss I do get is always very beautiful. To give some life to the water feature, I added some small anubias and a bit of Süßwassertang to it. I also added some fluval stratum as substrate. To bring it to life and tie it together with the rest of the vivarium, I also added some leaf litter into it. The water will eventually become slightly tinted by tannins from the leaves in the setup. Speaking of leaf litter, it was now time to add it to the rest of the vivarium as well. I used a mixture of mostly beech leaves and some European oak leaves that I collected myself. The most important thing is to get some type of leaves that don't break down too quickly. I boiled the leaves for a few minutes to get rid of any unwelcome guests, like spiders and slugs, and let them dry for a few days before adding them to the setup. While adding the leaf litter, I also added a coconut hut with a bit of moss placed on top of it, which may or may not survive. I didn't want to add too much leaf litter yet, since I have some small ground coverage plants that I didn't want to cover up. Now, the Vivarium Rebirth saga is finally complete, at least for now. I will definitely make a lot of changes to it over time. For instance, I'm considering replacing some of the bromeliads, and I will add a lot more micro orchids and other epiphytes to the hypertufa wall. However, I think this is a really good start, and I can't wait to see how it develops in the upcoming months and years. I will make an extensive update for you when it's a bit more grown in. I'm going to wait for a few months before adding the frogs to it. I want all the tiny plants in the setup to be properly established first, and the frogs are doing really well in their temporary homes, which are big enough for me to not feel stressed about them being in there for a bit longer. This project has been my biggest project ever, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing, because it's completely free and it really helps me out, and you can always unsubscribe later if you change your mind. Make sure to also press the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future uploads. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and I will see you in the next video. If you want to see more of my animal room, check out my Instagram page at gecko_geek06.